Hello, this is Michelle Renee with the Annenberg Institute for School Reform, and I'm really pleased to have this webinar today. It's the third in our series on time for equity, really amplifying the work of the different folks doing research, doing field work, and creating really valuable resources on educational equity around the country. This particular webinar is focused on the report from the Center for Education Policy on expanded learning time and a really rich summary of case studies in 4 different states. Maria Ferguson is going to take us through the webinar and lead us, the Executive Director of CEP. So without further ado, we're really thrilled to share the spotlight here with CEP on this great work and really get it out to folks doing this work in the field. So Maria, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. We're very glad to be here, and we thank the Annenberg Institute for School Reform and for the Ford Foundation for supporting this good work and for bringing us together with Annenberg. My name is Maria Ferguson. I'm the Executive Director of the Center on Education Policy. We like to refer to the center as CEP, so if it's okay, that's how I'm going to refer to it. CEP is an independent center for education research and analysis. We're housed independently at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. We are a nonpartisan organization, and we don't represent any special interests, and we don't advocate for any issue or individual agenda. So for that reason, a lot of people think of CEP as a very trusted source for this kind of research and analysis. Today, we're going to be talking to you about the findings from CEP's latest study called Expanded Learning Time, a Summary of Findings from Case Studies in 4 States. This report and the 15 case studies that accompany it provide a detailed look at how states and districts are using federal funds to support expanded learning time as part of an overall school improvement strategy. The publications are a deep and excellent resource for any community that wants to look at the benefits and challenges of expanded learning time. Because we spoke to so many states and districts, the report really presents a broad range of the different ways people are doing this and the different challenges that they encountered. So we hope that's instructive for people, no matter where they live. Both the report and the case studies are available free of charge on CEP's website, which is www.cep-dc.org. And there's a host of other resources there as well. If you have any questions at any time during the webinar, submit them via the question box on the right side of your screen. We'll answer them and discuss your submissions at the end of the presentation. But right now, I'm going to turn it over to the 2 people at CEP who led this work. Dr. Jennifer McMurr, she's CEP's Director of Research, and Matt Frizzell, CEP's Research Associate. They're the co-authors of this study and did yeoman's work in getting it done. So thanks for being with us this afternoon. I'll talk to you at the end when we start going to the question and answer period. And I'm going to hand it over to Matt and Jennifer.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Again, today, my colleague Matt and I are going to talk a little bit about some of the key findings from our recent study on expanded learning time. During the presentation, we'll provide some illustrative examples of our findings from the case study schools and states that we visited, and we'll also talk about some policy implications that are specific to ELT and low achieving schools that relate back to this research. Just to begin and to provide some context, we're going to begin with a very brief overview of the federal lens and policy requirements that are related to expanded learning time, which really inform why we conducted the study. First of all, we know that in recent years, many low-performing schools across the nation have increased learning time in response to the federal requirements for the School Improvement Grant Program, which is also known as SIG. 2 of the reform models under SIG, one called Turnaround and the other called Transformation, specifically require schools to establish schedules and implement strategies that provide increased learning time, among other requirements. Next, the conditions governing federal waivers of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which is also known as ESCA or NCLB, also require certain schools to redesign their school day, week, or year to include additional time for student learning as well as for teacher collaboration. These waivers also allow for flexibility to redirect some of the certain federal funding streams towards increased learning time. For example, states may request flexibility to use some of their federal 21st Century Community Learning Center grants to expand learning activities during the regular school day. Traditionally, these federal grants had been used to provide academic and enrichment opportunities to students during non-school hours, such as before, after school, on weekends, during the summer, for targeted groups of students. We'll talk a little bit more about this specific flexibility with the 21st Century grants, as well as some of the other federal programs related to ELT throughout the presentation of the key findings.
Hello, everyone. My name's Matt, and thank you for joining us today. Considering the policies that Jennifer just mentioned, the purpose of our study was to look at state and local efforts to expand learning time through the unique lens of state and local responses to those specific federal provisions. In particular, we investigated the strategies being used by the case study sites to meet federal requirements and encouragements for increased or expanded learning time, and then the challenges, successes, and impacts associated with this implementation process. We also inquired about the state and local officials' perceptions about expanded learning time and whether they think it's an effective school improvement strategy.
So the actual states, districts, and schools that we included in this particular study were purposefully selected for what researchers call, quote, maximal variation sampling. In general terms, what we mean is we really intended to represent a mix of geographic locations as well as urbanicity and preparedness and support for expanded learning time at the state level to answer our research questions. So the sample of states that we selected from met specific criteria, the first being that they were implementing the SIG program, the second being that they had received a waiver under ESCA, and the third being that they had also requested to waive some of the requirements of the 21st Century Community Learning Center program. So as of August 2013, which was the time when we selected states for this study, there were a total of 20 states that met these three criteria. So after conducting some preliminary background research about ELT initiatives in various states, and then doing some informal interviews with experts in the field, we selected 4 states for the study, and they're included here on this slide on the left-hand side column. They included Colorado, Connecticut, Oregon, and Virginia. We had assembled a list of all the districts with schools that had received federal SIG funds and were implementing either the transformation or the turnaround school improvement models, which require ELT, were designated as a priority school under the state's waiver or had received a 21st century funding. So ultimately, CEP ended up collecting data from 17 schools within 11 districts across these 4 states. So just a background note, to encourage frank and candid responses from our local study participants, we promised that their names, as well as the names of the districts and schools, would be anonymous. So pseudonyms are used throughout our reports and this presentation in place of the actual names of the individual schools and districts. So the table that's on this slide lists the states, but then we also list the pseudonyms, which we based on watch and clock manufacturers, of the schools and districts that we studied across these 4 states.
From October 2013 through March 2014, CEP staff and consultants visited all of the participating districts and the majority of participating schools. We conducted formal, semi-structured interviews with 49 education leaders, including 13 state education officials, 18 district leaders, and 18 school principals. We also gathered information from the state ESE waiver applications and other relevant state, district, and school policy documents. Today, we will highlight the key findings from the study and provide illustrative examples from the case study districts and schools. All key findings in today's discussions are the result of cross-cutting themes. That is to say, districts and states may have their own themes that are excluded from this presentation and the summary report because they were not found within multiple districts or multiple states, but they are outlined in the case study files posted on the CEP website.
So to begin with the key findings, we found that our case study schools and districts are meeting the federal requirements to expand learning time, but that ELT generally is costly, and the short-term nature of the federal grants, specifically SIG, is causing some difficulties for some schools. The districts and schools faced a major challenge that was cited by nearly all of our case study interviewees in actually sustaining ELT after the federal grants end. For example, at Santos High School in Oregon, our study participants cited insufficient funding as one of the major challenges to implementing ELT and explained that this will be especially problematic when the SIG grant period ends for them. When SIG ends for this particular school, they will no longer receive special funding for academic interventions, which are currently in place in the form of a Saturday tutoring program and is entirely funded through the SIG program. In addition, some of our case study districts and schools reported difficulty with meshing federally funded ELT initiatives alongside of their already existing local reforms. For example, the Saco district in Colorado uses what's called a competency-based system, where students progress through the grades or levels by demonstrating mastery of specific content rather than by putting in traditional seat time to progress through the grades. So because of this system and non-traditional, there's been a non-traditional approach to expanded learning time, which our study participants at that particular school and district explained allowed their students to spend more time on subjects that are giving them difficulty and then less time on subjects where they're doing well. Interviewees at the schools and this district level specifically cited the mismatch between the overarching objectives of this CBS model alongside the traditional approaches to seat time and the state assessment system, as well as the state and federal requirements for accountability and school improvement that are specific to ELT. I personally think that the Saco case study is a really unique and very interesting report to read in light of the CBS model in relation to how they've incorporated expanded learning time in that district and in specific schools.
Next, we found our case study districts and schools differed in when and how they expanded learning time. To add instructional time for students, some schools and districts are extending the start or end times of the regular school day or reducing non-instructional time within the day, while others are adding days to the school year. Some schools are adding learning opportunities before or after school or even during the summer. For example, Minerva School District in Virginia added time to the school day for Pythagoras Elementary School. Coram School District in the same state added more time to the school day by 30 minutes and school days to the year. But in adding school days to the year, they did not exceed the maximum number of school days in the teacher's contract. Furthermore, this district expanded time for all district schools to avoid transportation issues. Schools are also using the expanded time in different ways. For example, some are increasing time for teacher collaboration and professional development, as well as for student instruction. This was a key component of ELT at Ebel School in Connecticut, where school leaders explained that teachers begin their school day 1 hour before the start time for students. They use this time for teacher-led professional development sessions and collaborative planning time. a change that the principal said has led to higher quality, more rigorous classroom instruction. And many schools are using additional time for student enrichment as well as academic activities, and some employ third-party providers to deliver these services. At the Gretchen School in Connecticut, they have strong partnerships with external community organizations that enable them to revamp the entire school day and offer ELT to all its students. School officials said that staggering teachers' schedules and including both morning and afternoon blocks for interventions, enrichment, and other programs for students with community partners was a successful marriage that reduced costs of implementing ELT.
So the state, district, and school leaders that participated in these case studies often emphasize that improving the quality of instruction in low-performing schools was just as important as increasing the quantity of instructional time. More specifically, for example, the state leaders that we spoke with in Virginia said that they really focus more on professional development in hard-to-staff SIG schools because the teachers there need more time for themselves to develop their craft. There were other study participants who simultaneously warned about the potentially negative impact on students when extra time is simply more of the same. So setting aside more time for teachers to collaborate on instructional planning and to improve their knowledge and skills through professional development was often seen by our study participants as a way to improve that instructional quality. Some of our district and school leaders believed that expanding time for these types of teacher activities was actually more effective than increasing instructional time for the students at the school.
We also found that there was evidence of improved student outcomes in some, but not all of the case study schools. However, it's important to know that several schools were in the early stages of ELT implementation at the time of the study, so they weren't able to speak to any of the outcomes that might have occurred because of its reform. In some schools, student test scores or graduation rates improved, while other schools reported improvements in student performance on classroom and interim assessments. For example, at Corduba High School in Oregon, the once part-time alternative high school became a full-day alternative high school. The principal explained that the school's ELT schedule and subsequent programming options contributed to increases in graduation rates because they kept the students engaged and connected through the relevant and more hands-on experiences. An example of these experiences includes students who had access to working with local environmental groups to maintain hiking trails, remove invasive species, and restore wetlands. The principal explained that they have created a school environment that not only offers a wide range of support for its students, but also encourages students to take advantage of different learning opportunities. The principal at Frogman in Colorado cited growth in student achievement on interim assessments as one success stemming from the additional time for instruction. The school also used expanded time to focus on school culture and support systems that improve the overall climate at the school. Bien Elementary in Connecticut saw large increases in the percentage of its students scoring proficient in reading and math on state tests since they received SIG funds. The principal attributed these gains to multiple school improvement initiatives, including increased focus on rigor, use of data, common planning time for teachers, and the longer school day. All our case study interviews were careful to note that improvement cannot be attributed solely to ELT because of the many simultaneous reforms being undertaken in these schools.
Next, we found that few of our case study districts and schools were actually taking advantage of the flexibility which was afforded by the waivers to redirect certain federal funding streams to ELT. Very few of the districts that we studied were supporting ELT with the 20% set-aside funds, which were previously reserved for school choice and supplemental tutoring services under the Title I program, but is currently an allowable use of funds under specific states' waivers. And only a few of the districts and schools with access to the 21st Century Community Learning Center grants were using those funds to expand learning time for all its students during the regular school day, which is also permitted by the waivers. One example of a school that was using the 21st Century funds for ELT purposes during the regular school day was Patria in Virginia. The school leaders there worked with their 21st Century Learning Center provider to arrange for tutors to come in during a 90-minute block of instructional time each day to help support the teachers in the classroom for specific middle school grades. Patria also used their 20% set-aside funds to put towards teacher compensation and other related ELT expenses. The other school leaders from our study noted that this option to use the 21st century monies for all students during the regular school day would simply cost more than their current traditional use of the 21st century grants, which is to provide learning opportunities for targeted groups of students outside of the regular school day.
States and districts varied in their level of involvement and support for the ELT initiatives in schools. Case study schools with innovation or charter status in Colorado and case study schools in Connecticut reported fewer challenges implementing ELT programs than other schools in the study. This may be partly due to policies and programs particular to these two states that help facilitate ELT. For example, Pathfinder in Colorado has innovation status under Colorado's 2008 Innovation Schools Act. The status allows the school to seek waivers from some district-level policies and includes flexibility in complying with staffing, scheduling, and budgeting policies. The principal at Pathfinder explained that this control over schedules, personnel, and money has helped facilitate the school's ELT efforts, and the innovation label has helped reduce teacher attrition because applicants know upfront that these schools are likely to have an extended schedule. The charter school status at Frogman provides a similar context, and the principal explained because ELT is built into the structure of the school's charter school network, teachers and staff who work at the schools agree to the longer hours up front. Finally, there's strong support for ELT in Connecticut through such state-level programs like Alliance Districts and Commissioners Network Schools, both which come with supplemental state funding and resources for school improvement, which may include ELT.
So implementing ELT oftentimes comes with required negotiations with teachers' unions about such topics as contractual time and compensation, depending on how schools implemented ELT. Some of our case study districts reported very positive relationships with teachers' unions that they said enabled them to incorporate ELT as well as additional compensation for this time into new teacher contracts. Glycine in Connecticut is an example of one of those districts that reported very positive relationships in working with the teachers' union. In other districts, negotiations with unions and resistance from teachers more generally presented a challenge to implementing some aspects of ELT. Several of our case study schools ended up staggering their teacher schedules as well as partnering with outside organizations to really work with students to increase instructional time without having to change teachers' total contractual time. So as Matt talked about earlier, there were very strong, well-established partnerships with community organizations in the Gretchen case study school in Connecticut. For example, the school and district had partnered with the local junior league, whose members came into the school and taught students more about financial literacy. Similarly, they also had a partnership for an aerodynamics program that district officials said was paired nicely with the district's science curriculum. They also worked with the local theater company, which school officials reported complemented the existing literacy program at the school very well. Next, at Oceanus in Colorado, they also talked about having partnerships, specifically one with a privately funded tutoring and dinner program that was facilitated by an outside organization for the school, with the school. They also have a longer school day at Oceanus by about an hour for the 4th and 5th grade students, which the principal explained the school supports by staggering teachers' schedules. He explained that specifically the art, music, PE, and computer teachers all start their school day an hour later than the other teachers, and their classes are strategically scheduled during that additional hour at the end of the day for these 4th and 5th grade students.
Lastly, teacher and student fatigue from longer school days was cited as a challenge in implementing ELT in all 4 states studied. Leaders in several schools reported that staff had some difficulties maintaining their own stamina and keeping their students focused during the longer instructional blocks or longer days. One school in Connecticut, named Ebel, got rid of the longer blocks of instruction time for this reason and focused its ELT on teacher collaboration. Frogman in Colorado was planning to cut back a little on the academic instruction time for students. Some schools, such as Gretchen in Connecticut and Santos in Oregon, have balanced academic activities with enrichment activities to try and keep students interested, or they've brought in community partners to work with students and allow more time for teacher collaboration and planning.
So findings from CEP's case studies of districts and schools in these 4 states have several implications for policies, specifically policies to improve low-performing schools that use ELT strategies. First, ELT can be a beneficial approach to improving schools, but it's only one component of a more comprehensive school improvement effort. Our study participants unanimously agreed that ELT should be accompanied by other strategies to provide high quality instruction that maximize learning time. Next, the districts and schools reported they need flexibility to design ELT strategies that are suited to their specific contexts. Implementation of ELT really varied considerably across the schools and districts and states that we studied, and it was often contingent on factors such as specific state policies, local governance structures, school contexts, as well as individual teacher and student needs at the school. ELT policies should place priority on additional time for teacher collaboration and professional development, as well as student instruction. The state, district, and school leaders stressed the importance of improving the quality of instruction, which often meant more time for teacher collaboration and PD, rather than focusing on increasing the quantity of instructional time for students alone. Our interviewees viewed additional time for teacher collaboration and PD as a productive investment that ultimately improved the quality of instruction for students. Some of our participants also said that the benefits of teacher collaboration would outlast the cycle of the federal funding and may positively impact student achievement for years after the SIG funding expires. And then implementing and sustaining ELT initiatives entails additional costs. So any long-term effort for ELT will require a reliable funding source. So expanding learning time, as we know, typically involves additional expenses related to compensating teachers, staffing and coordinating before and after school or summer programs, and arranging for transportation for longer days, among other things. In summary, CEP's research indicates that the ELT provisions of the SIG and ESEA waiver requirements are performing a valuable function by encouraging the nation's most struggling schools to rethink their use of time. State, district, and school interviewees in the 4 states recognize that ELT initiatives could be beneficial in improving schools. But federal guidance could help facilitate more thoughtful use of time by providing increased flexibility to customize school improvement efforts to meet local needs and contexts.
The CEP summary report, as well as detailed reports for each of the 4 states and 11 districts, with the 17 case study schools, can be accessed free of charge from the CEP website at www.cep-dc.org. Now I'm going to pass it back to Maria for the question and answer session.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Jennifer. Really appreciate that good summary of the report. I want to remind people that if they have any questions, to submit them via the question box on the right side of the screen. We have our first question, which I'll start with. Question is, were you able to see any variation in findings based on the kind of ELT implemented? For example, what was different in the ELT models that were focused on changing the entire curriculum versus whole school schedule change, versus models that focused solely on teacher planning time versus models that focused on after school or weekend tutoring? So I know the question of findings here is a little gray because we don't have any exhaustive findings in terms of student achievement and otherwise based on this, but what did you see based on the variation of the models?
Well, it really varied depending on the school needs. So in some circumstances, and I'm thinking about a school in Connecticut specifically, they focused largely on more time for teachers. The demographic at the school entailed many English language learners and teachers who didn't feel as if they had the skills necessary to reach those students. So a lot of the professional development sessions that were planned and teacher-led before school were run by the ELL coordinator at the school. And so the teachers there felt the benefits of those sessions were immeasurable. And so the expanded time wasn't necessarily focused in that school directly on the students, but more so on the teacher time in order to improve instruction. And, it varied greatly depending on the school. I don't think that we could say universally one model resulted in one outcome and another model resulted in a different outcome that was unanimous across schools. It really depended on the needs at that particular school on where they focused that additional time.
Yeah, Jennifer, I think that's right on target. And I just want to kind of repeat that when you're looking at ELT, it's important to consider its context. And that's just so heavy in terms of how schools are able to implement what's going on and keep it sustained for long periods of time.
The next question we have relates to what kind of federal guidance on ELT would be valuable? And I think this is a little bit of a tricky question because one of the things I was thinking during your presentation is you clearly heard from your interviewees that having the flexibility and the freedom to choose how they were going to use ELT was a positive thing. But at the same sense, those of us who know the sausage making like process of federal guidance, there's always this desire to include some sort of structure, some sort of guidelines, research-based structures around federal law, around federal guidance. So what kind of federal guidance might be able to sort of shoot that gap between the two without having it be free fall, but also allowing these communities to have the flexibility they need?
Well, the current requirements are focused on providing expanded learning time for both students and teachers. And so making sure that there's flexibility on that balance, I think, is important. So if a particular school needs the expanded time more for teachers, then having that flexibility to use the funding for that purpose is important versus a school where they want to focus more of the expanded time on student instructional time, if that makes sense for the particular context and needs at the school. Does that answer the question somewhat, Maria?
Yeah, can I also add, Jennifer, that I think flexibility with planning the ELT is important, and in allowing students or schools and districts to really have some time before they implement these strategies, maybe a year or 2 years to plan how it's going to work in that context, and then some longevity with the funding. I think, as we've pointed out multiple times, that the sustainability issue with federal funds could be problematic once those funds dry up. So there's a little bit of flexibility with planning, and then maybe a little bit more flexibility with the implementation timeline.
Right. And probably the sort of just innate impatience of federal policymakers in terms of expectations and results. I thought the one comment that was so interesting that you guys pointed out was the person who talked about the long-term ramifications from the SIG money that would maybe reap benefits down the line because of this teacher collaboration time. You know, that is something that is often difficult for policymakers to get their hands around because they enjoy, you know, the concrete things a whole lot more. So that's an interesting dilemma. The next question is a really interesting one, and it looks at the issue of partnerships and intermediary organizations. Were any of the schools supported by intermediary organizations or other technical assistance providers? And if so, were there particular types of help that were especially useful or especially effective?
Yes, several of our schools had partnerships with intermediary organizations and technical assistance providers. There was one school in Colorado and another in Connecticut that comes to mind who had partnered with an outside organization that provided both both academic support as well as enrichment opportunities and meals, dinner programs, those types of things that are very important when students are spending, 7:30 a.m. till sometimes 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon in a school setting. So many of our study participants talked about how those partnerships were extremely important. However, they're also very time consuming to establish and maintain and organize. So there are turnover sometimes in these organizations that are inevitable. And so maintaining those partnerships and having someone dedicated to making sure that the curriculum is coordinated and that the extra time is actually thoughtfully planned alongside the current curriculum and that there are partnerships with the teachers is something that's very important and that is an integral part of that planning piece. At Gretchen in Connecticut, they spent an entire year talking about and planning just those partnerships and making sure that there was someone at the district level that helped with coordination alongside teacher leaders at the school, as well as the assistant principal, who obviously has many other responsibilities at the school, but there needed to be multiple levels of involvement in order to just orchestrate these partnerships.
Yeah, I think I can think of at least 2 examples where the state allowed some kind of intervention to come in or fostered an intervention with outside groups or even provided their own support systems. I know in Virginia they were required to actually pay the state to bring in someone to help them implement some of the policies, including ELT. And in Oregon, they fostered a relationship with a national organization that allowed them to restructure their school day and use some of the tools to do that. And those were all really state-led interventions.
The next question sort of circles back a little bit to the earlier conversation about federal guidance and determining impacts. And the question is, along with the case study model, are there other methods or instruments you found useful to measure the impact of ELT models, for example, survey models?
This was something that some of our case study participants in both Oregon and Colorado talked about, in that they felt they really wanted to be able to evaluate some of these strategies more empirically. However, there wasn't really a system in place to look at these interventions specifically. That said, it was also really difficult for school leaders and teachers to divorce the other strategies that were currently in place from what they were doing related to ELT to really isolate impact. at the school and to be able to attribute it directly to their ELT strategies. It's important to remember that the schools that we visited, for the most part, are SIG receiving schools that are implementing many different types of school reform efforts in addition to ELT simultaneously.
Yeah, Jennifer, I think that's exactly right. I don't think there are many ways to be able to measure this, unfortunately, with so many going on. I know a lot of the people we spoke to expressed some desire to do that, but they couldn't imagine any system that would be able to, as you said, divorce ELT from the other initiatives that they were implementing.
Okay, question here related to the funding sources. In any of these states, were there separate state funding streams eligible or targeted for ELT?
Yes, in Connecticut, actually, they have separate state level programs that are targeted for the state's lowest achieving schools. And some of these funding streams, by becoming eligible for these programs, allow for using these funds for ELT, among other things. When we asked directly about some of these programs, many of our study participants explained that, yes, there was a state funding stream for this. However, it was designated for multiple initiatives, not just ELT. So the funding stream had to be kind of peppered across various things. So it couldn't be solely focused on expanded learning time.
And in Virginia, there's a large funding bucket that's called Standards of Quality, and within that bucket there are different divisions. One of those divisions was specific to interventions for students who needed remediation, and in that you could pull from those funds to do school-wide ELT. So there were places, at least in Virginia, where it was kind of buried in with the state funding and could have been used for it, but wasn't specifically designated for ELT.
One of the things that you guys talked about was, I believe it was in Colorado, you talked about the schools that were actively engaged in a competency-based model. And I'm wondering, is ELT, or at least these federal funds supporting ELT, did they in any way sort of act as a catalyst for some of these schools to embrace different strategies like competency-based education or more experiential learning experiences? Would you say that perhaps that funding gave them an opportunity or a window to sort of walk down the roads of something a little bit different than what they had tried before?
Well, in SACO, which is where they had the competency-based systems, those were already in place prior to the SIG grant. So that system was already in place. But that being said, the district officials as well as the school officials there said that the requirement for ELT under the SIG program really did encourage them to rethink their use of time. And I think outside of SACO, several of our case study participants said that it was a very productive exercise to really look critically at the way that their school day was structured and to try to think strategically and thoughtfully about ways to increase time and focus on the areas that were needed most. So I do think it encouraged innovation. Matt, is there anything that you have to add, especially specific to SACO?
Well, I was actually going to jump from the district level up to the state level. I think SACO was an interesting case. And with their interestingness, they had a model in mind, and they were able to use ELT funds to support that model. So I'm not sure it really pushed them beyond the parameters of what they already wanted to do. However, to jump to the state level, I think in Connecticut, it pushed state leaders to rethink how they were using their 21st century learning grants, especially with redesigning those grants so that some of them, half of the state awarded grants, were designated towards ELT in the school day. And so I think when we look at this, there's the district implementation, but there's also the ability for the federal government to help states kind of reinvent what they're doing.
Interesting. This is sort of a question and a comment. Rather than determining the independent effect of ELT, since we already know that adding time isn't sufficient, could we also draw from the case studies or other methods which combinations of ELT and other strategies are more effective, maybe on a broader range of impacts than test scores alone? And I think this asks a very good question of, when we're looking at impact, what are we looking at? And when we focus solely on test scores, are we in some ways negating strategies that may be very effective by other measures, other more nuanced measures, if you will? And I think this, sort of taps into that larger question about how we really measure success and impact. Do you guys have any commentary on that, especially based on your conversations with these folks?
I do, actually. I was thinking specifically, several of our case study participants explained that their ELT efforts were not solely focused on academic interventions. There was a large portion of ELT that was focused on enrichment and engagement, and different types of learning experiences. So it was very important for the high school in Oregon that we studied to have these partnerships with the outside organizations that enabled their students to have these hands-on learning experiences with the nature trails and otherwise, that offered a very different type of learning experience that the principal touted as one way to keep students there engaged, to keep the students from dropping out of high school, to have them feel ownership and a connection with their own learning. And several of our case study participants talked about the importance of this balance between focusing solely on intervention and remediation, alongside providing these very rich, deep enrichment type activities as a different type of outcome measure in place. The charter school that we went to in Colorado also talked about the impact of the change in school culture. Having a little bit of extra time at the beginning of the day allowed them as a school to really focus more on the culture there and the camaraderie and the school pride and some of the activities that they didn't necessarily have time for before the longer school day. So there were lots of different factors that our principals cited as important outcomes of their ELT initiatives outside of increases in student test scores.
And Jennifer, can I just add to that what we talked about earlier? Bringing the community into the school. I don't know how you measure that, but having those community partners come in, working with the students, and then having the students be able to go back out into the community, I think, as the question points out, that's not something you can easily measure, but it is definitely an inherent advantage of what we saw in our districts.
There's a little bit, there was a district leader in Connecticut who brought up an important point that, there's a lot of responsibility laid on schools with student learning. And for her and for the way that they've implemented ELT in their district, it was very important for the community to be an active partner in learning. So who better to teach about financial literacy than the local junior league? Or who better to talk the relationships they had with the local theater company. For them, it was really important to have the community engaged in ways that they could offer very high quality instruction in ways that could complement what teachers were doing and help take some of that burden off of it just being a school initiative. It is a community initiative. It is a parent initiative. It's an everyone initiative. So that was an important component of ELT in that district.
One of the things that I thought was also very interesting about this report is that it sort of makes us look at ELT in terms of the impact on students, but also on the impact on teachers. And one of the questions we have is that, can you share a little more information about the different ways that teachers engaged in both designing and implementing the different ELT efforts?
Well, we were only able for this study to actually speak with district and school leaders. There were a handful of schools that I visited specifically where I was able to talk with and meet informally with some of the teachers, especially some of the teacher leaders who were charged with helping to coordinate and really design and plan these programs. There was one teacher leader at a school in Connecticut who was really the direct liaison at the school between the school and the district, and then the community partnerships person, just to make sure logistically that everything was in place. If someone called in sick for the local culinary class, that they could find a replacement. It wasn't as simple as going to your sub list from the district offices. So having that teacher leader as the coordinator and the liaison between her fellow teachers and those community partners was a really important piece of that year of planning that this particular school had when they designed their new schedule. I wish we were able to talk to more teachers for the study, but it was kind of peppered throughout our school visits as best as we could.
And an important part of what the school leaders said, who weren't teachers, were that the collaboration between teachers, which could mean curriculum development, it could mean working on the school culture, it could mean a whole variety of things. So we don't know exactly what they were doing in the collaboration, but that collaboration time really became an essential piece of ELT.
One of the principals I spoke with in Connecticut, who where they instituted the hour of professional development and teacher planning time before school, talked about the fact that they instituted this requirement, and the teachers really embraced it and ended up running with it in a way that he wasn't even sure. He said they've taken such ownership over that hour and that planning time that he didn't necessarily know every day exactly the topics that were being covered, because it was essentially whatever the teachers felt that they needed, they would try to coordinate amongst themselves. And whenever they felt that they didn't have the resources to address certain concerns or issues, they would come to him, and he would try to see what he could organize or facilitate outside of the school to bring someone in. But it became such an integral part once the SIG funding had ended at this particular school, and they had to think about how they were going to sustain these things. The teachers really pushed back and said that they wanted to continue with that additional hour in the mornings, and that they would try to do their best to compensate in other ways in order to maintain that additional hour of collaboration time.
I know we're getting to the end, but just also a technical point here, that if you actually want to see to pull up the chat window, you have to remember to actually click on the chat icon, just in case those of you who didn't know that. Okay, we have a question here that focuses specifically on English language learners. The question is, in terms of ELT efforts targeted at specific groups of students like English language learners, which of the case studies would I look at for examples of this, or examples of schools that had high numbers of ELLs, and how ELT looked in those schools?
We do provide some contextual information about each of our case study schools. We aren't, our individual case study write-ups do include some demographic backgrounds. However, we did promise anonymity, so we didn't provide exact numbers of those types of things. We also didn't focus on this topic specifically. So I'm trying to think of a case study school. Ebel in Connecticut was an area where their population had changed significantly at the school over the course of the years. So the English language learner coordinator was the teacher who actually facilitated a lot of the professional development during that additional hour of planning time. So I would point you towards the Ebel School case study in Connecticut. There were also schools in Oregon, but I think one of the better examples might be Ebel in Connecticut.
One question related to the fact that a lot of these districts and schools did not take advantage of the multiple ways that they could redirect their federal funds. The question is, were any school officials uncertain whether they could use federal ELT funds for teacher collaboration and professional development?
I think there was some confusion initially. The schools that we visited were at various stages of implementation. Some of the schools were in the last year of their SIG grant, others had finished the SIG grant, and some were in the very beginning. Many of our principals said that there was question initially on appropriate use of funds. However, their districts were able to sort that out. And it didn't seem to be a common misunderstanding. I think the bulk, when we asked specifically about why schools were not using the funding flexibilities, an important point was made in that, especially the 21st Century Community Learning Center grants, the total amount of money allocated to those programs didn't change. So just because schools were allowed to use those funds for all of their students during the regular school day didn't necessarily mean that schools wanted to change the way that they were currently funding those programs, which were targeted for specific students on after-school programs. So some schools just simply felt that they didn't want to change the focus because there wasn't enough money to spread through that particular program so that it could reach all students during the regular school day.
And Jennifer, I think if I can just add that the state role in support was important here. A state like Connecticut, which did offer a lot of support in terms of getting not only funds but information down to the school levels, versus maybe Oregon, which was a little more hands-off. Those districts may or may not have, and I don't want to speak for them, may or may not have had as great a picture or great access to the resources that were available because the states were a little bit more hands-off.
Guys, it's getting to be 2 o'clock, and I know we have a hard stop. I want to thank Jennifer and Matt for their time and extraordinary effort on this. I also want to thank the very nice people who sent us a couple of really sweet messages here and appreciation and thanks for this work. That means the world to us, and we're really glad to know that people find this valuable. So thank you so much for taking the time to do this. And thank you to the good people at Annenberg who worked with us on this. It's been a delight working with them and getting to know them. And I hope we all get to work together and talk about this important issue again soon. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.